an email while Diana was giving her retirement speech. The message came through at exactly 7:23 p.m. while I was standing in the back of the conference room holding a glass of champagne and listening to my mentor of 25 years talk about legacy and loyalty. The phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I almost didn't check it. My name is Hank Caldwell. I'm 49 years old, and 30 seconds after reading that email, I knew someone had just made the biggest mistake of their professional life. Deanna was up front talking about how the company used to value experience over politics, about how engineers like us built systems that lasted decades, not quarters. The room was full of people nodding and clapping, but I was staring at my phone screen. Henry Caldwell, employment termination, effective immediately. No explanation. No meeting, just a corporate template with my name plugged in. The sender was Victoria Ashford, Chief Innovation Officer and daughter of our CEO. She'd been trying to push me out for 8 months, calling my compliance systems legacy bottlenecks and talking about modernization. I handed my champagne to the guy next to me and stepped into the hallway. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a company-wide announcement. Preston Wells will assume Henry Caldwell's role overseeing federal infrastructure compliance for the courthouse renovation project. Preston, Victoria's 32-year-old cousin with an MBA and exactly zero experience in government contract requirements. They hadn't just fired me during my mentor's retirement party. They'd already announced my replacement to the entire company. Diana found me in the hallway 10 minutes later. She took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "What happened, Hank?" I showed her the phone. Deanna has been in this business for 40 years. She reads corporate politics better than most people read newspapers. "This is a mistake," she said, after scrolling through the messages, firing the compliance officer right before a federal audit period. Julian's lost his mind. Julian didn't send this, his daughter did. Diana's expression darkened. Victoria doesn't have termination authority. She does now, apparently. We stood there for a moment, listening to the laughter from inside the conference room. People toasting Diana's 4 decades of service while I was getting erased from the company directory. "You know what this means, don't you?" Diana said quietly. "That I'm unemployed, that someone's planning something they don't want you to see." Sarah was waiting in the parking lot when I came outside. My wife of 18 years took one look at my face and knew the evening had gone sideways. "What happened?" she asked. I showed her the phone. Sarah works for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Financial Crimes Unit. She reads corporate termination letters the way I read system diagnostics. Her expression changed as she scrolled through the messages. "This is sloppy," she said quietly, firing the compliance officer right before a federal audit period. "That's going to raise flags." What kind of flags? She handed the phone back, the kind that make prosecutors very interested in what someone's trying to hide. We drove home mostly in silence. I kept thinking about the courthouse renovation project. $180 million in federal contracts. 3 years of my life building compliance systems to track every vendor payment, every material specification, every change order. The kind of documentation that keeps companies out of federal prison. The system I'd built wasn't just software. It was an insurance policy against exactly the kind of fraud that destroys companies and sends executives to federal prison. Every invoice, every approval, every modification got logged with timestamps and digital signatures that couldn't be faked or deleted. Preston didn't understand any of that. To him, it was just another computer system. Point and click, approve and move on. He had no idea that every action he took would be recorded, tracked, and preserved for federal auditors. 2 days later, Sarah came home from work with a different expression on her face, the kind of look she gets when a case is about to break wide open. "Hank," she said, setting her briefcase down carefully on the kitchen table, "I need to ask you something about your old job, officially." I was sitting at the same table, still scrolling through job listings on my laptop. "Officially, we got a referral today. Anonymous tip about irregularities in federal contracting at Apex Infrastructure Group. Specifically, vendor invoice manipulation on the courthouse project." The coffee mug stopped halfway to my mouth. "What kind of manipulation?" Sarah pulled out her tablet and turned it toward me. Vendor invoices filled the screen, all from the past 6 weeks, all approved after I was fired. "These companies," she said, pointing to the names on the screen. "Do you recognize them?" I studied the list carefully. "That's Pinnacle Materials. We've used them for 5 years. But look at these unit prices." Sarah leaned closer. "What about them?" "They're inflated by about 30%. Same materials we've been buying for years, but suddenly they cost a third more." I scrolled down through more invoices. "And this one, Apex Construction Supply, I've never heard of them. That's because they were incorporated 3 weeks ago," Sarah said. "Same address as Preston Wells' apartment." Now the pattern was becoming clear. Preston had been approving invoices for inflated materials and kickback payments through shell companies. Companies that existed only on paper but were billing the federal government real money. How bad is it? I asked. Sarah's expression was grim. Conservative estimate based on what we can see, about 12 million in fraudulent billing over 6 weeks. If this pattern goes back further, or if there are more shell companies we haven't found yet, it could be 50 million or more, I finished. Federal contract fraud on that scale wasn't a fine or a slap on the wrist. It was 10 to 20-year prison sentences. The problem is proving it, Sarah continued. Most of the documentation is in your old company's systems. Systems that Preston now controls. I leaned back in my chair and almost smiled. Actually, no. He controls access to the systems, but he doesn't understand how they work. Sarah raised an eyebrow. My compliance tracking system doesn't just store invoices. It creates permanent audit logs. Every change, every approval, every access attempt gets recorded with timestamps and user IDs. Those logs can't be deleted or modified. Not by Preston, not by Victoria, not even by Julian himself, even by system administrators, especially by administrators. I learned that lesson the hard way in 2008 when my previous company tried to hide losses during the financial crisis. I built this system specifically to be tamper-proof. The logs are encrypted and backed up to federal servers in real time. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Would those logs show who approved the fraudulent invoices? Down to the minute. And they'd show if anyone tried to cover their tracks afterward. What about authorization chains? Could we trace who gave Preston permission to add new vendors? Every vendor registration requires executive-level approval with biometric authentication. If Victoria authorized those shell companies, there's a permanent record of her fingerprint and retinal scan. Sarah's prosecutor instincts were kicking into high gear. How quickly could federal investigators access those logs with a proper warrant? About 15 minutes. The system was designed for exactly this kind of transparency. She closed the tablet and looked at me. Hank, I think you're about to become a very important witness in a very big federal case. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a federal building downtown, across from 2 FBI agents and a prosecutor from Sarah's office. Not Sarah herself, conflict of interest, but her colleague, Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez. Mr. Caldwell Martinez said, "We need your help understanding these systems you built." The conference room table was covered with printouts. Invoice after invoice, all bearing Preston Wells's digital signature, all approved outside normal procurement procedures, all billing amounts that didn't match the original contract specifications I'd spent 3 years developing. "This is impressive work," Agent Foster said. She was the lead FBI investigator, a woman about my age with the kind of careful attention to detail I recognized from good engineers. "But we need to understand the approval process. How did these invoices bypass normal review?" I pointed to the timestamps on the document spread across the table. "See these dates and times? They're all approved on weekends or after 11 p.m. That's when the automatic review alerts are disabled for system maintenance." "Maintenance windows," Agent Foster nodded. Someone knew exactly when to slip these through. Preston would know. I trained him on the system architecture during his first week on the job. I explained how the audit controls worked, thinking he'd need to understand them for legitimate approvals. I pulled out my own laptop and connected it to their screen. I can show you exactly what happened. The screen filled with data logs, rows and rows of transactions, each one tagged with user IDs, timestamps, and approval chains. "Every action in the system creates a permanent record," I explained. When Preston approved that first fraudulent invoice on October 15th at 11:47 p.m., the system recorded not just the approval, but also his location, his device fingerprint, even how long he spent reviewing the documents. Agent Martinez leaned forward. How long did he spend? 47 seconds for a $180,000 invoice that should have required 20 minutes of documentation review. What about Victoria Ashford's role in this? I clicked to another screen. Her digital signature is on the vendor authorization forms. Every shell company Preston created had to be approved by an executive-level authority before they could bill federal contracts. The screen showed a series of vendor registration forms, each one bearing Victoria's biometric authentication. "So she knew?" Martinez asked. "She authorized every single one. The system required her fingerprint scan, retinal scan, and password for each new vendor registration. That's not something you can fake or delegate." I pulled up another screen, and here's the interesting part. Look at the timing of these authorizations. The investigators studied the timestamps. She approved 6 new vendors in a single 15-minute session at 2:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Each approval should take a minimum of 10 minutes if you're actually reviewing the documentation. Agent Foster whistled softly. She was rubber stamping them. "Gets better," I continued. The system logs show she accessed the vendor management portal from her personal laptop at home, not from the secure office terminal. That's a direct violation of federal security protocols. Martinez was taking notes rapidly. What's the total exposure here? Based on the invoices I can see in your files, $12 million over 6 weeks. But the system logs show Preston's been making these after-hours approvals for 4 months. And Victoria's been authorizing new vendors for 6 months. Your estimate? I'd been running the numbers in my head since the meeting started. Conservative estimate, 45 to 50 million in fraudulent billing. Worst case scenario, could be pushing 75 million if they started this right after I was fired and ramped up quickly. The room was quiet for a moment. Even for the FBI, $50 million in federal contract fraud was a big case. Agent Foster broke the silence. Mr. Caldwell, we're going to need complete access to your compliance systems. Can you provide that? Already done. I transferred administrative access to the federal audit team yesterday morning. Every log, every transaction, every backup is available for your investigation. What about Victoria and Preston? Do they know you've provided access? No. And here's the thing, they can't delete or modify any of the evidence even if they find out. The system stores everything on federal servers with real-time replication. Even if they destroyed every computer at Apex Infrastructure, the audit trail would still exist. Martinez smiled for the first time since the meeting started. How long would it take to compile a complete evidence package? The system can generate a comprehensive audit report in about 2 hours. Cross-referenced with bank records, vendor registrations, and contract authorizations. Everything you'd need for indictments. Agent Foster stood up. Mr. Caldwell, we're going to need you to run that report today. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Federal prosecutors don't mess around when they have documented evidence of systematic fraud, especially when it involves national security infrastructure like courthouses. Within 72 hours, the FBI had enough evidence for arrest warrants. The audit report I generated showed a clear pattern of fraud dating back 8 months. Shell companies created specifically to overbill federal contracts. Legitimate vendors paid kickbacks for inflated invoices. Safety specifications quietly downgraded to reduce material costs. Preston Wells was arrested at his apartment on a Tuesday morning. The FBI found $1.2 million in cash hidden in his bedroom closet, along with bank statements showing regular deposits from the shell companies. Victoria Ashford was taken into custody at the office the same day. Her arrest was broadcast live on the local news. FBI agents walking her out of Apex Infrastructure in handcuffs while employees watched from the windows. Julian Ashford, the CEO and Victoria's father, wasn't charged criminally but faced immediate civil asset forfeiture proceedings. The federal government froze all company accounts pending investigation, but the real damage was just beginning. Word of the arrests spread through the construction industry like wildfire. Within 48 hours, every major client started canceling contracts. The courthouse renovation was suspended pending investigation. The state highway project was terminated immediately. Insurance companies canceled their coverage. Apex Infrastructure Group went from a $200 million company to bankruptcy proceedings in 6 days. I wasn't watching any of this from the sidelines, though. 2 days after the arrests, my phone started ringing with a very different kind of call. Hank Caldwell? This is Director Thompson from the General Services Administration. We need to talk. I met with Director Thompson the following afternoon in a downtown federal building. The GSA oversees all federal construction projects, and they had a very big problem. Mr. Caldwell, Thompson said, settling into his chair across from me, the Apex situation has revealed systematic weaknesses in federal procurement oversight. We've identified at least 12 other contractors with similar vulnerability patterns. Similar how? Inadequate audit controls. Manual approval processes, no real-time monitoring of vendor relationships. He paused. We need someone who understands both the technical systems and the compliance requirements. You want me to audit other contractors? We want you to design a new compliance framework. Something that would make the kind of fraud we saw at Apex impossible across the entire federal contracting system. Thompson slid a folder across the table. We're prepared to offer your consulting firm a 3-year contract. Full modernization of procurement compliance for federal infrastructure projects. $4.2 million initial value, with expansion options based on performance. I opened the folder and stared at the contract terms. 6 weeks ago, I was unemployed. Now the federal government wanted to make me the architect of a new anti-fraud system. There's one condition, Thompson continued. We need this system operational within 6 months. Can your company handle that timeline? I had incorporated Caldwell Systems Consulting the week after my termination. At that point, it was a one-man operation working out of my home office. Mr. Thompson, I said, closing the folder, my company will make it work. 6 months later, I was standing in a different conference room presenting to a different group of executives. This time I was the one they were listening to. "Gentlemen," I said to the board of directors from Palmer Construction, "your current procurement systems have the same vulnerabilities that destroyed Apex infrastructure. We can fix that." Palmer Construction had won the courthouse contract after Apex's collapse, $220 million in federal funding, and they weren't taking any chances. My compliance system would track every invoice, every vendor, every change order from day one. Mr. Caldwell, the Palmer CEO, said, "What guarantee do we have that your system will prevent the kind of fraud we saw at Apex?" I clicked to the next slide on my presentation, because the people who tried to manipulate my last system are currently serving federal prison sentences. Victoria Ashford got 8 years. Preston Wells got 6 years. The system worked exactly as designed. The room was quiet for a moment, then the CEO leaned forward. "What's your implementation timeline?" "Full system deployment in 90 days, staff training in 30 days, real-time monitoring active from the first invoice." The contract was signed that afternoon, but Palmer Construction was just the beginning. Word about the Apex investigation had spread through the federal contracting community like a warning signal. Companies that had been cutting corners for years suddenly wanted bulletproof compliance systems. My phone rang constantly. Highway projects in Georgia, bridge construction in Tennessee, federal building renovations in North Carolina. Everyone wanted the system that had caught the biggest procurement fraud case in the region's history. Diana came out of retirement to join my company as senior advisor. She said it was the most satisfying work she'd done in 40 years of engineering. "You know what I like about this?" she asked one morning, reviewing our latest client proposals over coffee. "We're not just building compliance systems. We're building trust." She was right. The federal government had been burned by contractors for decades. Cost overruns, quality shortcuts, timeline delays, all because there was no way to track what was really happening on projects until it was too late. Now there was. Every transaction got logged, verified, and cross-referenced in real time. No more shell companies, no more inflated invoices, no more after-hours approvals that bypassed review. "How's the Palmer project going?" Diana asked, ahead of schedule and under budget. "No fraud flags, no compliance violations. First time in 15 years, a federal courthouse project has run clean. And the others?" I pulled up my laptop and showed her our client dashboard. 12 active projects across 6 states. Combined federal funding of $1.8 billion. 0 fraud incidents. "The system's working," I said. "Better than working, it's changing how people think about federal contracts." She was right about that too. Contractors who used to view compliance as bureaucratic overhead now saw it as competitive advantage. Clean audits meant faster payments, better bonding rates, and priority consideration for new projects. The companies that tried to cheat got caught immediately. The ones that played by the rules thrived. Sarah got promoted to senior prosecutor after the Apex case. She now heads the white-collar crime unit for the Eastern District, and her conviction rate has made her something of a legend in federal law enforcement circles. "You know what's funny?" she said one evening over dinner. "I'm getting fewer fraud referrals now, because there's less fraud, because your systems are catching problems before they become crimes. Contractors are self-correcting instead of trying to hide mistakes." That was the real victory. Not just catching fraud after it happened, but preventing it in the first place. The congressional testimony came 8 months later. The House Subcommittee on Government Operations wanted to understand how a single termination email had led to the largest procurement fraud investigation in regional history. "Mr. Caldwell," the committee chairman said, "in your professional opinion, how widespread is this type of fraud in federal contracting?" I looked out at the packed hearing room. C-SPAN cameras, rolling reporters taking notes. Industry executives in the back rows, probably wondering if their names would come up next. Congressman, based on my analysis of current compliance frameworks across federal infrastructure projects, I estimate that inadequate audit controls expose approximately $15 to $20 billion annually to systematic fraud risk. The number got everyone's attention, and your solution, real-time compliance monitoring for all federal contracts above $10 million. Mandatory use of tamper-proof audit systems, automatic flagging of suspicious patterns. I paused. The technology exists. We just need the political will to implement it. The legislation passed 6 months later. The Federal Contracting Transparency Act required all major government projects to use compliance systems meeting standards based largely on the framework I'd developed. My company went from 12 employees to 85 employees in 18 months. We opened offices in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Richmond. Every major federal contractor in the Southeast either used our systems or licensed our technology. Last month, I spoke at the National Association of Government Contractors about procurement fraud prevention. The audience was packed. Standing room only. These were the same people who used to view compliance officers as necessary evils. Now they were asking how to hire more of us. The Apex case had become a business school case study. Harvard, Wharton, Georgetown, they all taught courses on corporate governance using Victoria and Preston's downfall as the primary example. The Caldwell Protocol, they called it, real-time compliance monitoring that made systematic fraud impossible. I kept Victoria's termination email framed on my office wall, not out of spite, but as a reminder of how quickly things can change when you build systems the right way. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd fired me to hide evidence of fraud. Instead, she'd created the person who would expose it. Preston got out of federal prison after serving 4 years. I heard he was working construction labor in Alabama. Manual work, no access to financial systems. Probably the best thing that ever happened to him. Victoria still had 2 years left on her sentence. Federal prison for financial crimes isn't country club prison. She was learning that the hard way. Julian Ashford lost everything. The company, the house, the cars, the retirement accounts. Federal asset forfeiture doesn't leave much behind. Last I heard, he was working as a project manager for a small residential contractor in South Carolina. They'd all learned the same lesson, just in different ways. When you fire the person who built your compliance systems, you better make sure you understand how those systems work. And you better make sure you can live with what they might find these days. My company has 127 employees and offices in 5 states. We're the primary compliance vendor for federal infrastructure projects across the entire Southeast region. Our systems monitor over $3.2 billion in active federal contracts, but the real satisfaction isn't in the numbers. It's in the phone calls that don't come anymore. Hank, Sarah said last week over breakfast, you know what I realized? I haven't opened a major procurement fraud case in 8 months. She was right. The referrals that used to flood her office had slowed to a trickle. Not because fraud had disappeared, but because it was being caught and corrected before it became criminal. Your systems are making my job boring, she said with a smile. Good boring or bad boring. The best kind. I'd rather prevent crimes than prosecute them. Diana walked into my office yesterday carrying a newspaper clipping. At 67, she should be enjoying retirement, but she says this work keeps her sharp. Look at this, she said, spreading the article across my desk. It was from the Washington Post. Federal infrastructure projects see record low-cost overruns. The article detailed how procurement fraud incidents had dropped 73% since the implementation of mandatory compliance monitoring. They're calling it the Caldwell effect, Diana said. That's ridiculous. No, it's accurate. You changed how an entire industry operates. I looked at the numbers in the article. 347 federal projects completed under the new compliance standards. Average cost savings of 12% compared to historical norms. 0 major fraud incidents. It's not just me, I said. It's the system. It's the idea that transparency prevents corruption. Exactly. And that idea started with you building systems that couldn't be manipulated. Last month, I got an unexpected phone call from Julian Ashford. It was the first time we'd spoken since the arrests 2 years ago. Hank, he said, I wanted to call before you heard it from someone else. I'm filing personal bankruptcy next week. I didn't know what to say. The civil forfeiture took everything. The house, the retirement accounts, even Linda's jewelry. His voice sounded tired. I'm 64 years old and starting over. I'm sorry to hear that, Julian. No, you're not. And you shouldn't be. I let my daughter destroy a company that took 30 years to build. I ignored warning signs because I wanted to keep peace in my family. He paused. I should have listened to you about the compliance systems. I should have backed you up when Victoria started pushing for changes. I should have been a better CEO. Julian, I'm not calling for sympathy. I'm calling to say thank you, thank you. The investigation found problems that went back 3 years. Systematic cost overruns, safety shortcuts, vendor kickbacks that I never knew about. If you hadn't built those audit systems, if the fraud hadn't been exposed, someone could have died in one of our buildings. I hadn't thought about it that way. A federal courthouse with compromised structural integrity because we used substandard materials to save money. That's not just fraud, Hank. That's potential murder. The conversation stuck with me for days. I'd been focused on the financial aspects of the fraud, the stolen money, the violated contracts, the betrayed trust. But Julian was right. Cutting corners on federal infrastructure wasn't just theft. It was endangering lives. Every courthouse, every federal building, every bridge we monitored housed real people doing important work. Prosecutors like Sarah, judges making critical decisions, citizens exercising their constitutional rights. The compliance systems weren't just protecting money, they were protecting democracy itself. Preston's cousin contacted me last month. Apparently Preston wanted to apologize, but federal probation terms prohibited direct communication with investigation witnesses. He wanted me to tell you that prison changed him, she said during our brief phone call. He understands now that what he did wasn't just paperwork fraud. Real people got hurt. How so? The delay in the courthouse construction meant domestic violence cases got postponed for 8 months. Family court hearings pushed back indefinitely. People who needed justice had to wait because of what he did. I hadn't considered those consequences either. Victoria's lawyer sent a letter requesting character reference testimony for her parole hearing. I declined. Not out of vindictiveness, but because I didn't have anything helpful to say. She'd shown no remorse during the trial, blamed everyone else for her decisions, and tried to obstruct the investigation even after her arrest. Some people learn from consequences, others just learn to be more careful next time. The courthouse project that started this whole mess finally reopened last month. Palmer Construction finished it 4 months ahead of schedule and $1.8 million under budget. No fraud, no safety violations, no cost overruns. I attended the dedication ceremony. Federal judges, local officials, contractors, and community leaders all celebrating a project completed the right way. This courthouse will serve this community for the next 50 years, the chief judge said during his remarks. It was built with integrity, transparency, and respect for taxpayer dollars. It represents what federal infrastructure should be. Sitting in the audience, I thought about how different things might have been. If Victoria hadn't fired me, would I ever have discovered the fraud? Would Preston have continued stealing? Would the building have been completed with compromised materials? Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you personally becomes the best thing that happens to everyone else. Walking back to my car after the ceremony, I noticed Diana had stayed behind to talk with some of the Palmer construction engineers. At 67, she was still teaching, still sharing 4 decades of knowledge with the next generation. That's what this work is really about. Not just preventing fraud or catching thieves, building systems and sharing knowledge so the next generation can do better, so they don't have to learn these lessons the hard way. This story is fiction, but workplace betrayal and corporate corruption are real challenges that many professionals face. If you've ever been undervalued, pushed aside, or fired for doing the right thing, remember that expertise and integrity have long-term value that politics and connections can't match. Document your work, build systems that outlast the people who try to manipulate them, and never underestimate the power of doing things correctly the first time. The marketplace ultimately rewards competence over corruption, even when it takes time for justice to catch up.